agree.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Reimagining Service Delivery, a world-class public service event. I'm Kate Harrington. I'm your MC for today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in New South Wales. I'm personally on Gadigal land, so I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to wherever you are in New South Wales today. So this is very new ground for me, so I feel quite strange talking to you all from my kitchen, but thank you very much for making the time to join us, and thank you to our speakers today. So I'm just going to test the tech a little bit further and switch to a presentation. So just bear with me for 1 second. No, I've failed. It worked seamlessly. Let me try this one more time. Okay.
That's looking encouraging. Well done, you.
Okay, let's go here. Okay, so I'm hoping that you can share my screen.
Great, success.
Yep,
Yay!
well
done. So as I say, welcome to Reimagining Service Delivery, and this event is about building a world-class public service, and I think that our topic today around digital transformation couldn't be more important in our current climate. So just going through the agenda for this morning, we're set to run till 9 o'clock. So again, thank you everyone who's got up so early to join us today. What's important about world-class service delivery is how we deliver for the people of New South Wales. So the Premier has made Premier's priority 14, building a world-class public service. And that's all about transforming the experience of citizens interacting with government, before improving the performance of government itself, and of course supporting a competitive economy for New South Wales. We have already launched in New South Wales Beyond Digital, a strategy all about how we engage with customers. You can see at the top of the screen there the principles that we want to instill across the public sector about how we're responsive to our community. The Premier's priority is quite specific in terms of implementing best practice productivity and digital capability, as well as driving public sector diversity. So we want to make the New South Wales public service a place where people want to work. And I think events like this and everyone's fantastic spirit about joining in today is a real step in getting there. So we have also set up a hashtag for you to use this morning. So there is a chat function in the Zoom link that you're seeing us all on at the moment. So please go in and use the chat function. But if you're more comfortable with a hashtag on Twitter, you go to New South Wales World Class Public Service, NSWWCPS, and use that hashtag, and I'll try and moderate those questions for our speakers. We have 3 speakers today, and I'll introduce them each in turn. First of all, I'd like to welcome Christian. Christian's joining us from Copenhagen, so it's the middle of Sunday night in Copenhagen, so a huge thank you to Christian for being with us this morning. Martin Stewart-Weeks, who's here in Sydney, but still get up nice and early for us. Thank you, Martin. And Scott Johnston, our Public Service Commissioner. So I'll introduce each of them in turn, but right now I'll just stop sharing this screen. admit some more participants to the meeting. And let me introduce Christian. So Christian is the Chief Executive of the Danish Design Council. He's also CEO of the Design Society, a foundation which is the parent company of the Danish Design Centre. From 2014, Christian built a reputation as a leading digital thinker and practitioner on public innovation as Director of MindLab, the Danish government's innovation team. So I'd like to hand over to Christian, who will first of all give us a presentation, but then also take your questions, as I say, either via the chat function or via Twitter. So welcome, Christian.
Well, good morning, everyone, or as I say, good evening from Copenhagen. Let me try to share my my screen and my presentation with you. So it's really a pleasure to be with you and share some perspectives. I was encouraged to share some personal reflections and maybe also a few reflections that are particularly timely given the emerging crisis we are finding ourselves in around the world, certainly also here in Denmark. So some reflections and some perspectives, and I've chosen to emphasize the design side. However, all the way through my career, certainly starting with MindLab in 2007, digital has been a major part of almost any type of program or innovation we've been focusing on. And of course, these days we're seeing ourselves being catapulted into an even more digital reality. So I'll address that, of course, along the way as well. Let's see if we can shift here. So one of my currently favorite quotes is this one from the David Graeber, the anthropologist, who's also an activist actually, and he was in fact one of the leading activists behind Occupy Wall Street. However, this quote I think is interesting because we have to remind ourselves also, not least in time of crisis, that the world is something we make and something that we can take responsibility for and be in charge of. And making the world is really what design is about. It's about taking responsibility for changing things for the better. And there's a certain profession and a field of practice that can help us as decision makers, also in government, to understand perhaps better ways of doing so. But it all starts with recognition that we can actually change the world if we want to. So the mission that we're pursuing at the Danish Design Center we call empowering business and people and society to shape the next. And by society we mean not least public institutions and civil society for that matter as well. So we work as an institution that is co-funded by the Ministry of Business, and we act in all kinds of practical ways, exactly like a public body would do. However, we are an independent foundation, and as such, we have an arm's length from government, but a very close relationship. This is our humble home on the waterfront in Copenhagen. Currently not so open for business, but usually this is we share this space with a number of institutions and also private firms that are focusing on our urban future. And looking at how can we innovate and find new system solutions to the challenge of cities around the world and nationally. The building is called Blocks, which you might find quite straightforward. It's been quite controversial because it's designed by a Dutch architect, and being in Denmark, that's slightly problematic, of course. But I do look forward to returning to the building as soon as possible. Over the years, I've been engaged quite a lot in the issue of public sector innovation. A couple of the books I've co-authored or authored here. And interestingly enough, although this field of practice around innovation in government, it changes and it morphs into different types of directions, it doesn't really go away. And you can say certainly currently that there's a renewed type of pressure on public institutions at all levels to really reimagine what they do and find new ways of doing things. As some here in Denmark have been saying, it's really an interesting time because we can really almost real time compare the responses of and agility of different governments around the world and see who do best, because everybody is facing more or less the same type of challenge, of course, with different context and different conditions, but still it's a bit of a global experiment going on right now. Just a couple of examples of what we work with that might be relevant for background, and also how that relates to the crisis. We're running a major program right now helping small and medium-sized enterprises digitize, and of course we're asking ourselves, when we have this public funding we're using to actually bring digital design agencies into SMEs, how can we accelerate that kind of work right now when a lot of small and medium-sized companies are really struggling? So for us, the question has become over the last week or so, should we take everything we've got in terms of funding and program activities and throw it at SMEs and help? Or should we go small scale, and even though we do have funding to help a lot of companies, actually start with just a few and find out what works? Because nobody's tried this situation before, and we are quite worried that we'll be throwing good money ultimately after bad money in terms of helping companies that don't stand a chance anyway. So what we're doing right now is really taking a design approach, which means small scale, very targeted interventions. We're running right now 10 small experiments with companies and design firms to find out how can we actually run these digital sprints where we take a very intensive process and assist companies and find ways of which we can really quickly learn what seems to work, what kind of problems are they facing, how best to digitize everything from sales to reaching new types of customers to internal processes. And once we learn more through these very small scale experiments, we can then scale them up and hopefully do much more, and also going forward with other government programs. But this is just to share what we would say a design approach is when it comes to this kind of public intervention. Another example we're working on right now that probably resonates with some of you is on the issue of young people who have been placed in foster care and who need to transform back to adult life after having been in foster care or in institutions. And this is a classic, which I think I also see in your actually strategy for New South Wales, the Public Service Commission looking into joined up services. In Denmark, it's so that when you turn 18, you actually experience a break in legislation where there's an entirely different set of legislation that governs your life when you turn 18 as when you were under 18 and considered ultimately a child under somebody else's care. And so that means that the transition here is very abrupt, and about 25% of all homeless people in Denmark are actually have formally been in foster care. So we have a major challenge here. We work on this one with a big foundation in Denmark and an international advisory board as well, including from Australia. One last piece of work I wanted to share with you that's ongoing right now is becoming eerily relevant. So in January, I ran a conference with about 130 participants on the future of society by 2050 around different themes like future of welfare, we called it Thrive, future of work, future of manufacturing, future of mobility, and the future of housing, which we call Stay. And when we did this scenario work, what we do is we look at how can we explore different types of futures, alternative futures, basically in a 4x4 grid. And when we explore futures, we try to make them very tangible and concrete. And right now we're actually working on making very tangible, concrete futures with using sort of user-centered stories and narratives that will be cast by actors about what will it be like to live in different futures, looking through these different lenses of work and of manufacturing, of mobility, and so on. I'll share with you just out of showing you what we've been doing, the axis of this scenario work, because it says something about the kind of society we might be going into. So the axis we chose when we did this work, and as it's being built right now, were between either how do we organize ourselves in society and what drives value creation. And the argument here is that all four scenarios here all the four quadrants are actually equally plausible. They could all happen. And again, remember the timeline we used to explore this a few months ago was 2050. But now I'm asking myself whether this is going to happen. One of the scenarios will happen very quickly, which is the scenario where we have a very centralized, very top-down governed controlling of society, in many countries at least, also in Denmark, and where we have a situation where the market is not allowed to govern anymore, but where other concerns such as climate change, health, other broader societal needs are put at the center. And interestingly, since we've been doing this work, I'm looking very much forward to exploring all the sort of the consequences of living and working in that kind of society, because it looks like that might become a reality in just in months. So anyway, just a piece of work that's ongoing, and if you want to take a look at it, you can find it on experimentationbydesign.dk, our site. So when I talk about design, just taking a step back, what we mean is, basically taking courses of action that intend to change the situation into a better one. That's a very, very overall story about design, or take on design by Herbert Simon, the Nobel Prize winner. But the industrial designer John Heskett said something that might be even more pertinent, which is that design is our human capacity to shape our environments in ways that satisfies our needs and give meaning to our lives. And to me, that is in many ways also the ethos of public service, that we are responsible for shaping environments through regulation, through funding, through programming, and we are responsible to find ways that satisfy needs, of course also make priorities and balance them, and also provide meaning, a sense of purpose, and provide services and interventions that make sense to people. And my sense is that too often we fail at that. Because we give priority to other skills, other domains, other professions, which are also extremely relevant for public governance, including law, economics, political science, and so on. But what about the human factor? And one thing is putting citizen-centered or customer-centric into a strategy paper. The other one is, the other challenge is making that happen. And it's just very, very hard. When I shifted from leading MindLab, in 8 years, advising governments, mostly in Denmark, but also internationally, around sort of human-centered innovation through design, and then started running the Danish Design Center, where we do quite a lot of sort of externally oriented programming, where we fund them and we run the programs and we design the programs. I discovered how hard it is to, so to speak, eat your own dog food. It's actually really, really hard to build in the systems and processes to really ensure that you do become so to speak, human-centered, and also the co-creation side, which is to involve and engage stakeholders in the process of designing programs. It's also very hard, not just because of methods and skills and tools, but also because of time and constraints of resources, or because of interests that you kind of can be a little bit worried. Who are you involving in designing a program? What kind of interest do they bring to the table, and how might they disrupt your beautiful plans? So I would just say that the experience of going from more advisory to actually operating these programs for me has also been quite the eye-opener. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pursue design, I think, in a big way in challenging our government, our way of running governance. Reimagining problems by being more critical of theories of change, more critical of the briefs we get handed down also politically. So respectfully challenging the types of briefs we look at. Always attempting to start with human beings. I think often there are other interests at stake than end users, but somebody has to take the end user voice and place it more centrally in policy development. This iterative experimental approach, I mean, to me, it was highly satisfying to be able to take this approach just right now when we're working with SMEs, but also take the approach when we are running this program we're running with the kids coming out of foster care, where we put 2 young people in the advisory board of the entire, actually the steering committee, the deciding steering committee of the program, to bring in the human voice and also to experiment. Experimentation can also mean what would happen if we allowed citizens to take even more control of their own lives. What would happen if we tried this at small scale, and how can we maybe scale things up? And finally, visualization is, to me, it's an approach to see the same thing, even though we are very different. So if you want to bring in more diversity, in government? Well, a high diversity of cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, professional backgrounds means it's harder to communicate. And visualization, seeing a service journey, seeing service processes, excuse me, can all of that be a way of looking at systems in a joined up way and of bringing in different skills and professions on the same problem. So visualization of the entire development and policy processes and service design processes is extremely critical. And we do actually need professionals who are skilled at visualization, and that would typically be designers. I'll in a moment shift to my actual mission here, which is to address the question of leadership and leading transformation through design. Before doing so, just setting the scene with three different approaches that we typically see in design work, right? So coming up close to problems is seeing what citizens see, empathizing, spending time with people, using qualitative research, ethnographic research. You can absolutely also learn a lot with quantitative data and being much, much better at using all types of data sets to get insights and find patterns around citizens. But nothing can really replace ultimately seeing things for yourself. And so coming up close to practice and by visiting people and doing this kind of research is key in design work. The other part is of this co-creation side of bringing in multiple stakeholders in the processes of creating programs, interventions, and where all the scientific research shows that more diversity of views, more diversity of participants enhances the likelihood you'll get good ideas that will actually work in practice. This is something that requires an insistence on bringing in other voices because it's always easier to just go it alone. And finally, this experimentation approach to really insist on going small scale early before ramping things up. These days, that's very, very difficult to do. We see governments make major decisions without really any experimentation time at all, which is probably necessary given the speed of things emerging. But that, of course, also raises the bar and the risks massively. Wherever we can, we need to see if we can do things small scale first, maybe even just for a few days. So the big game in all of this is really ultimately shifting from a model where what government does is to deliver something to citizens, and where we are the experts from the inside out designing programs to co-design and to co-producing with citizens. We have examples in Denmark where very disadvantaged groups of citizens have been invited in to be co-producers of their own outcomes in terms of thriving, for example, for people in care homes, handicapped individuals in institutions, or in this case we're working on right now, young people out of foster care. What would happen if they were co-producers of their own outcomes and empowered to do so rather than passive recipients? I usually say that we get the citizens we deserve, and if you treat people as passive recipients at the end of delivery, then that's often what you get. One thing I wanted to just share before moving to the leadership question is the question of values. I won't go through all these 10 values on the screen for you here, but this is just reflecting on that design has become, and design thinking has become this very big global phenomenon where we may forget how we are also different. And when it comes to public services, they're always anchored in culture and history, in a political context. And so the question becomes, how do you reflect on and be aware of the values with which you innovate and with which you design? In Denmark, we spent almost 2 years working with industry associations, professional designers, and stakeholders to map out what is the Danish design DNA, as we call it. There's actually a major website called designdna.dk where you can look at this more. But just to share with you some of the values, for example, holistic, that means also balancing the environment. Social means that we've always, also in industrial design, taken quite a societal approach, thinking about the inclusion, for example, of people with lesser means. And also in Danish design language or Danish design DNA, always a quite clean, simple aesthetic that's quite unpretentious and quite discreet, but still effective. So these are some of the things that we've reflected on and And both, of course, in industrial design, but also in service design and in public services, we see many of these values present. And it's been helpful to us to be able to articulate them, make them more explicit. So, leadership. One of the things that ultimately led me to write a PhD about design and management in the public sector was that I discovered that no matter how many methods and processes and tools you throw at a problem, if the responsible managers do not embrace new ways of working and are not, in a sense, open enough or even courageous enough to embrace these ways of working, there's really no chance of success. So the question becomes, what does it take for a leader, for a manager to bring in design work and design methods, quite often digital design, and make the best of it? And what kind of pitfalls and challenges can you expect to see along the way? And that's basically what I'll share with you for the last 12 minutes of my presentation. So this quote here, I think, is just extremely relevant right now, right? So just like designers, managers are thrown into situations that they did not make up themselves, but where they're required to make a desired outcome. Right now, this global virus has given us, as public managers, a major responsibility, and it's not something of our own making. We have to operate in this problem space. It's very hard to judge which solution is superior, and yet we do have to act. And that is the very difficult space you find yourself in quite often in a management position when it comes to innovation. And it is certainly the case for a lot of people right now around the world. But even after this crisis, it will always be the case that we are confronted with problems that we have to respond to. And so that's where we bring in a similarity between the task of a designer and the task of a manager. Now, managers in government that look for design, in my experience, and also from my doctoral research, typically face problems of performance pressure. They face challenges where they have a vision that they want to embrace, or they even see that here's an approach they might deploy. I think right now the pressure to perform is probably the main one. But all these three different motives are typically what you find cast public managers to work with design teams. Three major pitfalls. So you sometimes wonder, why would you in 1978 have established something called the Danish Design Center to help decision makers in business and government work with design as a force for competitiveness, for innovation, and for placing customers at the center of their practice? And I think in many ways, the essence is in what I'll show you now, because the world of design and the world of bringing in a human perspective in organizations is just always going to be challenging, because something else always wins. Systems, strategies, investments, also various types of power structures. So it'll always be a challenge to bring this outside-in perspective, and it'll always be a challenge to bring in a human perspective. So a colleague and I wrote this article for Harvard Business Review last year, and it basically says slightly arrogant title, but the essence is, how to lead teams working with design, how to lead your team in your organization as you bring in these methodologies, whether you work with an external consultancy team or you work with an internal innovation lab, or you train people in your organization to work with design. So the first challenge, the first pitfall is this empathic data. We tell our staff, our colleagues, to be rational and to be objective. But the methodologies and approaches in design are very subjective and personal. They're about sense making, about meaning making, about what do people feel, what do they experience. You even in your strategy, I saw earlier this morning, put in, what's the experience? Well, experiences can be quite emotional. So how do you deal with this sometimes even overwhelmingly affecting data that you get back from design research? How do you manage that as a public manager? And here I think the approach is to leverage empathy. Now, leveraging empathy means using, in a strategic way, insight into people's behaviors and experiences to change things for the better. An example is a head nurse we worked with when I was at MindLab, where patient interviews, 20 in total, basically showed that the clinic, which is the heart clinic of the National Hospital in Copenhagen, was not providing a joined-up service to people at all. You had patients waiting for a very, very long time without any information. You had people being examined in rooms not designed for examination and feeling humiliated. You had people being relayed information and where they fell asleep while getting it, and without doctors noticing that the patient was actually sleeping. This is what happens when you do observation studies, so you can get so up close, you can see what exactly is going on. And so using audio recordings of interviews with patients, the head nurse took all those recordings and sound bites, and we helped her organize them into patterns and into insights, into strategic challenges. And then she basically took 40 staff together in a room and said, listen to this. And she then played back soundbite after soundbite after soundbite of patients telling their stories about how the service and experience and sense making was really non-existent or very challenged. And as the head nurse working with the head doctor said, what I really wanted to do was to disturb them. I wanted to push and provoke a reaction, because we are dealing with healthcare professionals who are very, very good at their jobs. They're very good and they know it, but they're just not very good at creating a joined up service experience. And they also means they have a very wasteful process where patients are not really effective patients or easy to work with because of the lack of information. So that's the first challenge, is to take this emphatic data and use it in a constructive way to galvanize change. And in this case, galvanize quite massive change in the clinic, including a significant cost saving, because they were able to actually treat patients faster and more fluently and more joined up and get them out of the hospital quickly again for about 50% of the patients in this case. Second challenge is this whole idea of iteration. This whole idea of just do it go on our own can be quite a challenge. And employees will ask that question of you as a leader, as a manager: why are we spending time on this? Why aren't we just racing to the finish line? Why aren't we just getting along with this? And it puts massive pressure on managers who need to say, to keep the tension for a while and say, hold on, let's wait. So we call that encourage divergence and navigate ambiguity, which means basically insist that we do need to diverge, do need to expand the number of ideas we have in play, do need to explore other options than the ones right in front of us, even at times of pressure and crisis. And we need to be able to, with some degree of comfort, navigate the ambiguity that we don't yet still know what exactly will work. So an example is a leader from an educational institution in Denmark saying that this is basically about losing control, but in a positive way. We have to see loss of control for a while at least as something that is acceptable and even to be encouraged. You cannot co-create, co-design, allow empowerment of people, of your staff, of partners, if you do not let go, and even letting go to a point where you do not know at all what will come out of this. And again, I think we find ourselves right now in a period of time where this is hugely relevant. Last pitfall or challenge is this idea of failing on purpose. In design language, there's a lot of focus on failing forward, fail fast to succeed sooner. In digital, we have the whole agile manifesto and the encouragement of rapid testing of software and digital products. Just ship it and see what happens. Let's go to beta mode and so forth. But that all sounds very, very logical when you read it and when you sort of embrace it. But doing it as a manager in an organization that is designed to avoid failure and designed for consistency. It's designed for producing expected results, that is designed not to deliver any surprises, certainly not to the political level. That can be very, very challenging. I was running a workshop last year with the Canadian Public Service in Victoria and in British Columbia, and we had a conversation with some of the leading the senior officials, and one point somebody says, well, the political level or political masters, they don't mind innovation. What they mind is being surprised. But prototyping and testing does involve a slight bit of surprise, certainly when things don't work out. The key here, of course, is small scale. It cannot be emphasized enough that we're not talking about pilot testing here. We're talking about small scale iterations. We're talking about very few citizens, or we're talking about workshopping. We're talking about user engagement in early design. And that is where we need to do this. But still, there is friction, there is a challenge, and very often this feeling of piling up unsuccessful outcomes is quite challenging to people. So that's a pitfall at the core of what we espouse when we talk about design practice. So this ability to rehearse new futures and do that without fear is really the critical challenge for leaders. And now I have a all fresh quote for you. Well, it's all about creating value for users and for staff at the same time. It's all about making sure that you don't just test with citizens, you also test internally in the organization. I wanted to add a quote from the Danish Prime Minister at this point about testing and failure, because just last week when the PM in Denmark, Ms. Mette Frederiksen, shut down the country, when she went on the press briefing, and actually she did this on more than one occasion, she said, "We are going to make mistakes now." And by the way, I should say this is a prime minister who very much likes to be in control. This is a kind of a reputation also as a former minister. But she said, "We are going to make mistakes now, and I'm going to make mistakes." And she's been saying that pretty consistently over the last couple of weeks at more or less every press briefing. And I think that this is sort of the ultimate sort of quote from a senior leader in government, that in a time of crisis, going up front and saying, this is what you can expect. And by the way, I can tell you that there have already been a couple of mistakes as far as at least the public is concerned. So that's serving her very well already. And here's the quote, and here's an image from my LinkedIn update recently. You can read it if you go online, where I reflect on this point: what happens when the top executive fails on purpose. We'll see whether somebody ultimately will attack her for that. So far, it has not been the case. It's actually been the case that this has bought the leader quite some space to try whatever works. All right. I'll end with this quote on what I also write in this article from LinkedIn about the Danish PM, that this is all about is adopting a design attitude. It means that every project or every challenge is really an opportunity. It's an opportunity for invention. It's an opportunity to question assumptions. And even at this time, I think we do see some potentiality, at least, of creating a better world than the one we found. Thanks for listening. And I'm happy to take, I'll stop sharing, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Christian. It's really timely and insightful, I think, for all of us. So there is an active chat running on Zoom, so I encourage everybody to post their questions there. Also, we have, I'll remind you of the Twitter hashtag. It's NSWWCPS. So if you want to post your questions for Christian, please use those channels. I'll kick off. Christian, you talked a lot about the willingness to accept failure, and I think that New South Wales is an incredibly risk-averse public sector. How do we sell that risk? How do we say that this is an acceptable way to move forward?
Well, so first of all, I'm happy to hear that you are risk-averse in New South Wales. As a citizen there, I would be worried if you said anything else. Nobody wants the government actually to say that we embrace risk and we experiment with your lives. But the way I think is helpful in framing this is that the reason we need to experiment and try things out and involve citizens in the early stages and so forth is where we do not know what the right answer is. We need to absolutely deploy evidence and best practices wherever they are proven to work. And of course, respective of context, of similarities between whatever the best practice came from, we should do that. But experimentation and trial and error is needed when we really do not know what is going to work. And it's needed at small scale. So it's all about actually designing risk out of the system through experimentation. You could argue actually that the best argument for design-led approaches and experimentation is de-risking. But of course, the paradox is that you have to take a certain amount of calculated risk to de-risk, right? And you have to think about your language as well. Of course, in my presentation here, I used the language of failure. That's a word that, of course, is all kinds of lights go or start blinking when you say the word failure in government. Maybe we should start using the word learning, because that's actually what we're talking about. It's cycles of learning. And interestingly, very few government organizations have a very clear model of learning. Very few have, like some in the private sector, have chief learning officers. Very few can articulate how they learn, where they process feedback, what the feedback mechanism is, how they bring learning into decision making, and so forth. So I think there's actually a ripe space for exploring what cycles of learning mean, and then maybe we should tone down the sort of Silicon Valley type language around failing fast.
Thanks. I think that's true. I mean, I generally work in sort of IT domain, so it's a language that's a little more acceptable, I think, yeah, in the agile kind of IT space. But the more you sort of move into budget discussions and citizen outcomes, talking about failure is very brave. We also have, you talked about getting feedback. I've probably got two questions that sort of relate to that citizen feedback. One, how do you find the right people to participate as citizens in these programs? So how can you engage with them effectively in ways that don't sound like it's just a public servant giving a nod and thinking about, well, this is how I think people want to be consulted. And the second part of that is, how do you measure the effectiveness of that engagement? And I guess that question of measurement relates back to thinking about failure as learning, but maybe talk to the citizen engagement part first.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, because of course I have had civil servants, managers say to me that they're actually just going out on the street and finding 2 or 4 random citizens would actually inform them much more than what they've got today. So just getting out of the office is a good start, but of course that's not particularly strategic. So there are different approaches in this kind of research domain, right? Design research or grounded research. But often you would actually go for some extreme cases to learn exactly as you say. So you would go for strategic selection of a small handful of individuals, often informed by data, right? So you'd have some patterns of data, you have complaints, you have your call centers, you have all kinds of patterns coming in, but you want to learn and you want to go out to some carefully selected examples. And each citizens you actually look at as an experiment in itself, which means it's a case study. It's a case study of a citizen. So for example, when we looked at how digital tax services were used by young people in Denmark, we said, well, we're going to need to explore in depth how a young woman with an ethnic background different than Danish would experience this. We need to explore how a young person outside of a big city, so in a rural area, would experience this. We need to explore how someone with a very short educational background would experience this. We need to find somebody with a long educational background, and so on. So by using that kind of thinking and strategies, you select, in this case, we worked with 7 or 8 individuals. And when you find patterns, you then explore more, right? So you add another layer, you may interview more people, you may visit even more. And then you match the pattern with the data you have about what the problem is at a quantitative level. And that's where it gets interesting, right? That you see a connection between what you find in qualitatively and what you find quantitatively. So I don't think that we're talking about not using the digital data you have, not using the call center material you have, and so on. But there's just a huge eye opener in going out and seeing for yourself. And also back to the empathy point, nobody unfortunately empathizes much with a memo or with a quantitative table of figures, but people empathize with people. And so it's all about getting this rich material home, including audio and video, and sharing that. And it's just always very useful. It's not something that stands alone, but it's something that often drives change.
Christian, we've been having conversations in the New South Wales public sector about separating data analytics from the capture of the data. So how mature we are in terms of a data-rich organisation. How do you think about that citizen engagement being a little bit more independent when it comes to analysing those results? So looking at a qualitative outcome, it's difficult if you're the close service delivery person to those citizens, guiding the research and engagement, and then actually analysing the outcomes. How could we maybe be better at separating that independence?
Yeah. So I think that's a really difficult question, right? Is how you organize these processes and how you organize these capabilities. On the one side, you want to be close to your organization, right? And you want to involve the key staff that ultimately will have to change systems, to change practices, to make policy proposals, and so on. On the other side, these types of ways of working, including, I mean, data analytics is a profession in itself, right? Qualitative research and ethnographic research, design research, also sort of more engaging design work where you actually co-design with citizens is also a profession. So you want to build up environments and skills that are actually really good. And you're never good if you only do things every 6 months. You're good if you do that at your daily practice, right? So on the one side, you want to build up environments and capabilities and skills that are quite strong. And I would absolutely, in my mind, integrate the quantitative and the qualitative and then data analytics with this sort of thick data of ethnography. But I'll also place these types of competencies very close to the organization. Because if you do too much of an arm's length, then you risk these. I mean, we see the labs around the world, some of them being challenged by being too far away from the organization and not being sort of embedded enough, right? So I'd absolutely try to do both, although that's difficult to do.
Thank you. So we've got a question in the chat that relates to this about now's the time to experiment, but also how do we balance experimentation with the speed of response. So obviously very timely with the situation we find ourselves in now. How do you strike that balance between engaging with, a good representation of our citizens, but at the same time moving quite quickly into a solution mode?
Yeah, so right now I think we're seeing some really interesting examples of citizens themselves building platforms. I've counted by now about 3 different digital platforms built by citizens and small business themselves to capture the real number of people in Denmark infected by the coronavirus. So you see a lot of bottom-up work happening, and here the trick basically is to encourage this kind of bottom-up and then embrace it, and from the government side, and maybe also choose which one to go with in terms of what then becomes sort of the more official one. So I think there's one is sort of embracing what already emerges. The other one is from the sort of top-down perspective. How do you give a dosage of interventions that allow you to learn? So give an example, the program I mentioned, we're running with small and medium-sized enterprises, which suddenly has become not just kind of a nice thing to do, but a really critical one. We have the opportunity to work with 40 companies so far. And we've said, let's start with 10. So we're starting with 10, we started last week, and we're now rapidly deploying design teams to work with these 10 companies, and then following them very closely to learn what kind of problems, what kind of solutions come up. And once we sort of almost live get that data, we can then begin to ramp up towards the 40. And of course, we're hoping we can get up to the hundreds if we get more government backing to do so. But I think that's just an example, and it's a hard choice to make. Are we doing 5 or doing 10? Do we do 20? And when we go, do we go from 10 to 40, or do we go 10 then 20, or and so forth? So I think it's there's no true science to this, but I think it's a question of just not going too big too early. I would say, but of course, I mean, I totally recognize that in some decisions, like when Denmark was sort of shutting down 2 weeks ago, almost the date that was a decision that had to be done full scale. So I think that's also from a decision maker point of view, you have to distinguish when are we facing a problem that requires also like tax law that needs to sort of be implemented like that, right? You can't experiment always with tax law. When are we having a decision that has to go full scale immediately, and when are we in a place where we can allow ourselves experimentation? And making the distinction between the kind of problem spaces is just really, really critical.
Okay, thank you. So we've got another question on the on Zoom chat. So Terry says, I worked for an organisation that moved from public ownership to private ownership, and the relaxation of procurement requirements led to rapid collaboration with suppliers and a step change in transformation. How can the public sector balance our probity requirements and a more flexible private sector engagement process?
That's a nice question. I've seen the opposite happen though as well. I've seen people from the private sector go into government and get into a lot of trouble because they kept doing the private sector practices, even with government compliance, right? But of course, it's about striking the balance, right? So I think we all know that a lot can be done to create much more agile, open, collaborative, and nimble government procurement. And we're going to need that certainly going forward right now. On the other side, there are some universal principles that you shouldn't be able to just pick your cousin's company for using taxpayer money for a particular job, and that you should have a reasonable competition in place before choosing. So I think it's a really nice example you're giving. That turns out things could be nimbler and faster and more flexible and more collaborative. Around the world, like for example at Mars in Canada, there has been some nice experimentation with this kind of co-design for public procurement, and I think there's lots of learning there. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that there are some public governance issues that we need to keep in place, and that's the real trick in keeping them in place and then being faster, as you say.
Okay, and Kushra, I think we'll take one more question because we did start a couple of minutes late. I'm aware that it's quite late at night for you. We've got a question from Meredith. A key challenge is getting together the right set of expertise from subject matter experts with digital experience. In my experience, there are different languages and cultures that are hard to bring together at the leadership level. Have you got any tips for us?
Yeah, that's very much, again, the experience I was mentioning in the sort of the design and digital space. Because you want the subject matter has to be in there, right? So what we try to do, and also not least when we piloted this at MindLab, is to create an environment that's really attractive for subject matter experts to be part of. So let's imagine you're leading an effort that's digital or innovation effort. You really want to be extremely professional and make some attractive settings that are easy to understand, easy to engage with, well prepared, and where you really curate them in ways where subject matter experts can bring their knowledge into play, and where they feel respected and seen and heard, and that their knowledge is seen as valuable, even though they might come from a less digital world, or come from a world that's you're trying to change. I remember one workshop where we were trying to redesign basically the vocational training system in Denmark, and there was one subject matter expert in the room who was just really, really resisting all the time. And after the session, we found out that he was basically the one who single-handedly designed the current system. And so no wonder that he was slightly resistant. It was his system. He was the system that everybody was discussing how to change this stuff that's not working. So I think it's just, respect and curation is key. And then you just have to say that there will always be that friction, I think, between the deep solid expertise and then those who just want to sort of, so to speak, move forward and digitize or innovate.
Okay, great. And look, I tell terrible lies online. I've got one more question. It's actually one of mine. I'm really interested. So we're running some digital learning pathway pilots out of the PSC at the moment, and we've got 8 programs from around government participating in that. I'm constantly being asked about how we measure the success of that learning culture. And you talked about, you know, how we talk about failing fast in a more acceptable language about, well, we're learning what we're doing and how we're participating. But how would we measure that? How, in building a world-class public service, when we're reporting back to the Premier and saying these are the things that that we're doing to help build this culture, how do we measure it? What do we do?
Yeah. So. First of all, I think there's something we haven't addressed yet, but in this conversation, but you're bringing it really to the forefront on measurement, because one of the things that is important in design work is to not put up a lot of key performance indicators or measurements up front. It's all about discovery and finding out what is worth measuring. So I think that's a starting point to say, actually, when you embrace or engage in such a process, it is not just a process of finding solutions or interventions or designing programs. It's actually also about discovering what is relevant to measure, what are meaningful, relevant, pertinent ways of capturing what's valuable. That's one point. Another point is to think about different levels of measurement. So at the Danish Design Center, we've worked on something we call a learning mechanism. And the learning mechanism works with measurement levels at of course, you know, project or intervention level, but also at entity or organizational entity level, and then at you know, domain level, sort of organizational level, full scale, and then at systems level. And I think so across a sector, for example. And I think you might want to really think about what's worth measuring at the different levels. What are signs of success? And by the way, the idea of signs rather than sort of proof might be good to use as well. So what would be indicators or signs of success rather than, you know, proof of success when you're talking about emerging practices? And then I would say, allow yourself to be surprised. Allow yourself to find things when you talk about learning. You know, what could be indicators, cultural change. What could be indicators, and probably do it through interviews with people and interviews with key people involved in it about what actually is valuable to them, rather than like a top-down, deductive, analytical theory of change kind of analysis. Theories of change can emerge, of course, from this kind of work, but I actually wouldn't start with it. I'd be actually quite open to it. And then I'd actually be quite open to changing indicators over time. So as you learn about the learning, you change them. That's also why I think we need these learning mechanisms, because even reflecting on what is relevant to measure will change over time.
Fantastic. All right, it's a brave new world for me, Christian. Thank you. We might pause on the questions there. Christian, are you able to stay with us for a little while if there's any more questions?
Yes, I am,
come
absolutely.
through? Thank you very much. So, so now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Martin Stewart-Weeks. I've known Martin for many years. He's been the chair of the advisory panel in my role at Department of Customer Service. But Martin is an independent advisor, writer and facilitator who works at the intersection of public sector policy, technology and innovation. He's worked for both the Australian and New South Wales governments and led international teams and helped design and implement public sector strategy and social impact programs for Deloitte and PwC. I've got some questions lined up for Martin, certainly after reading his latest book. But I'll hand over to Martin. Martin, am I going to drive your slides?
If you would, I'm just trying to minimise technology stuff up here, and you're getting so expert at this, it might be easier. I only have a very few slides to go through, so if you wouldn't mind scrolling.
I will do my best.
Yeah, get them up get it up as you go. Look, I just want to say a couple of quick introductory things before we get going. One of which is not on the slides at all. Fabulous to hear from Christian again. It's so great to be working with him again. I've known Christian and his work, followed his work for quite some time, and there's never a conversation that doesn't end up giving plenty of food for thought and all the rest of it. And I think we've got that in spades. The first point I wanted to pick up, frankly, was this notion that in a sense, it doesn't make much sense to talk about the digital piece outside of its relationship to many other pieces, including design. And of course, you know, if we're going to stick with the D word, with data as well. And as you'll see from the opening of my few remarks, I've coined a phrase from the book, which I will talk a little bit about, although I don't want to turn this into too much of a marketing plug. The point about digital transformation is that digital transformation isn't the point. And I think the more we can fuse that notion of digital capability into larger observations about change, I think the better. That's not at all, by the way, to suggest that the digital piece is, you know, easy or sort of insignificant or a sort of a second order issue. It's very hard work, believe me. I've been close enough to this work and had a crack at some of it over many years to know just how tough it can be to deliver really, really good quality digital solutions. But nonetheless, I think it's a very important observation that in a sense, the digital piece matters most when in a sense, it's almost most invisible. So I want to make a few quick remarks. I don't know, Kate, whether, are we able to share the whole screen? I've got, there's a little bit of a, you see that?
Sorry,
right
I've lost my toolbar.
Can you click
my
on
digital
that little
transformation is not quite complete.
No, that's cool. If you, there's a little arrow on the, on the actual screen just here where it says comment, fill and sign. If you click on that little arrow, I think it will go away just to the right of the words where it says comment, fill and sign, more tools. Are you able to click on, if you're able to click on the little arrow on the right-hand side of the, down there, keep going down. See how you go.
I've actually got Zoom lying on top of it. That's where we've gone wrong.
Okay. So if you can get, oh, here we go. We'll get there. That's okay. View full screen. There we go. Thanks, Richard. That might be the way to go. Let's just take a, that's all right.
No, I'm tech failing.
No, it's all right. It's obviously there. I can see it. What happened? Yeah, it's just there's a little arrow in the bar there, little, just to the left of there, just in the little tiny little triangle. Now keep going. Yeah, just click. There we go. Done. Beautiful. Let's just scroll through these slides, and I'll make a general point at the end. But if you go to the next slide, I mean, in a sense, this is the kind of story I really want to tell right from the get-go, and it's a pretty simple one, and it's very much picking up many of the themes that Christian has opened up so well. In the end, I think the notion of a world-class public service, I think, is a public service that begins to understand the relationship between these three things: empathy, trust, and competence. And I think Christian has already given us some great examples of many of these values, but I think it's their interrelationship that we're all beginning to learn matters most when it comes to understanding what public service is in the current environment, not just in the current emergency environment, but the emerging world of digital transformation is beginning to tell us. The quote on the right, which I've highlighted just the sort of quick headlines in the red writing, is actually a quote from page 102 of the book that Simon Cooper and I published last year. And it really does reinforce this notion that increasingly we are living in a world where the digital component of the way we design, deliver, and even conceive of the role of government and the way public services are delivered needs to be able to contribute to these three things. The first obvious point is empathy. I don't think there's much more I need to say about that, in the sense that I think for the last 45 minutes, you've had some very, very powerful signals from Christian's work and his own thinking that increasingly the notion of empathy, the notion, and I'm going to say something about this in terms of actual service delivery design, the notion of empathy is becoming absolutely central. The notion that citizens are looking for government services and agencies who have some capacity to get into their shoes, to see the world from their perspective. And it's pretty obvious when you think about it. It's no great insight. But people tend to respond much more to people who offer them a sense that they understand and are empathetic with the conditions and circumstances they're in. The second one I would call out is competence. There's no question at all that people much prefer to deal with companies, with services, with websites, with governments, whoever it is, that just basically get the job done and look as though they know what they're doing. There was a terrific piece of work that I remember the Canadian national government did. I think it must be well over 15 years ago, and they were doing some early whole of public service surveying about customer service. And the thing they uncovered, because it leads to my third word, is that the more people remarked or reflected that the services they dealt with government were competent, that they just did the job, they got the problem sorted out, they got the service, the more their measured quotient, if you like, of trust in government went up. So the relationship between competence and trust is, again, pretty obvious when you think about it. We tend to trust people who seem to know what they're doing, and we tend to not trust people who do not seem to know what they're doing. So again, not exactly what you'd call a rocket science insight, but I am increasingly of the view that a world-class public service right now, and certainly into the next 5 to 10 years, infused deeply, I think, by the power and potential of digital tools, exactly of the sort that we're experimenting with this very morning, is a public service that works out at every level: policy making, regulation making, service delivery, impacting communities, how to link those three values in everything they do: the way they talk to citizens, the way they take evidence, the way they trial and test, all the things we've been hearing about this morning. Anyway, let's move on to the next slide and get some ideas about the context that we're in. Pretty obvious, but I'm going to labour the point slightly. We are certainly in a difficult period where I think we've all heard about the FUD factor: fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I think, gosh, there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think a lot of genuine and quite legitimate fear and a sense of trepidation about where all of this is leading us, how long it's going to take, and all the rest of it. I think we've uncovered in the last few weeks what I would call some resilience deficits in Australia. I don't know about the story in Copenhagen, but certainly as I follow the story around other parts of the world, particularly in the US and North America, you know, basic stuff actually, like trust and empathy in government, like basic infrastructure, including digital infrastructure, we may have turned out to be slightly behind the eight ball. And I think that's a bit of an anxiety. We are also in a period where the emergency seems to be trumping everything. You know, if in doubt, get it done, because things are urgent. We're under great pressure. I think that's a good thing, and I think it can be a risky thing. There's a great comment on the chat line on this call where somebody noticed, isn't it amazing what you can get done in a good emergency? As they say, I think it's a Chinese proverb. It might be someone else can claim it. Never waste a good crisis, right? We seem to be barreling through a bunch of changes. You know, we're having national cabinets, you know, we're having a sort of a daily COAG meeting. It's kind of, whoa, is this, well, you know, maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing, but the emergency is getting a lot of things changed. Fourth thing well working is that digital does indeed at the moment seem to be the only game in town, as indeed we are proving this morning. We are now giving our platforms and our infrastructure and the services around our digital capabilities a real thrashing, which I think is terrific. And I think it's also reinforcing that digital only works where, and again, I think Christian has reinforced this stuff so well, where culture and leadership come with it. The last point I would make is, are we going to bounce back from this emergency, or are we going to bounce forward? By that I mean, are we going to use this emergency to in fact find really quite different ways of working and cement and solidify some of the great breakthroughs that we've had in terms of the way we experiment, the way we innovate, and the way we make change happen? Or are we going to sort of, as soon as we can, go back to something more familiar in some of the ways that we were coming so familiar with just only a few weeks ago? The picture in the background is Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, and there's an interesting quote from a Sydney Morning Herald article a couple of days ago about why it is that Andrew Cuomo is being used in America as an absolute poster child at the moment about what good government and world-class government should be. And if you look at what he's saying and the way he's behaving, Andrew Cuomo, and a bit like the Danish Prime Minister, if I listen to Christian's story, is that he's combining empathy, he's combining competence, including acknowledging where clearly the New York State situation is very, very difficult. and as a consequence of that, he's building trust. Pretty impressive. Let's keep moving to the next slide. Thanks, Kate. We could roll up to the next one. So first set of principles. The first thing I would say is that you'll see I've taken them straight out of the New South Wales story. I mean, those 6 provisions, those 6 precepts: easy to engage, act with empathy. It's one of our words of the morning, I guess, or the evening if you're in Copenhagen. Respect my time. Explain. What am I going to expect? Resolve the situation, get the job done. Engage. I mean, gosh, I wouldn't argue too many with those. But there are 3 on the side there that I've picked up. One of which at the beginning is in fact some work that I did last year and some work I've been watching in Queensland with the Queensland Public Service Commission. And that is this notion of public services working, and it's a kind of different way of saying the empathy word. Hear me, see me, help me. In other words, what people are asking for, they're not asking for gold-plated public services. They're not asking for unreasonable responses. They understand the world is full of constraints and then trade-offs. But at the bottom of the whole conversation, at the heart of the conversation, there is this instinctive yearning by people for governments to hear them and to see them, and then as a consequence of that, to help them. I think secondly, we're expecting public services increasingly to be able to look, listen and learn right at the beginning. And this is exactly the point that Christian has been making. He's given 3 or 4 great examples in terms of, youth at risk, redesigning the vet system, the vocational education system, some of the fantastic work that's going on at the front line in the health sector. This is about people who are prepared to, as they say, hasten slowly and say, hang on a minute, before we start jumping to conclusions or solutions or answers, we have to look, listen and learn. I remember facilitating a workshop where Tim Reardon, when he was the head of transport, started his presentation, a whole room full of public servants saying, the problem sometimes for us is that we are trained with, I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but I think he won't mind the quote. We're trained to within an inch of our life to come up with draft answers. Almost every meeting we go to, wherever it is. What we've got to learn to do is that we've got to get better at asking draft questions. And I think this notion of slowing down in order to go faster is important. And then the third general principle I would put down, I think increasingly for service delivery, particularly in the digital era, is simplicity, consistency, and what I would describe as legibility. And what do I mean by that? It's kind of not quite the same thing as transparency. Legibility means I need to be able to understand as a citizen where this is coming from. How are you making the decisions that you're making? How are you coming to the conclusions that you're coming to? Why are you testing and experimenting this way? Help me understand what you're trying to do. Draw me into that process so that as a citizen, the whole game becomes a whole lot more legible to me. As I say, I think it's more than just transparency, which is I can see what you're doing. Legibility seems to me to be a word that's a little bit more about understanding and about engagement and about being able to navigate through what you're doing. So that would be one. The second set of principles I wanted to talk about, if we could just scroll up again, Kate, thanks. There's a lot of words on this slide, and obviously all the slides will be circulated. And they come actually from an interesting place. I've been working recently with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, or TAXI. Some of you on this call may have come across TAXI. I was on their board for many years, although I haven't been on the board now for a couple of years. We put a proposal to the New South Wales Research and Development Policy Review that Gabriel Upton is chairing and leading for the Premier, about this notion about the way in which in Australia we need to develop something we've dubbed a social R&D system. And a social R&D system is essentially about how do we get more predictable, systematic and scalable at learning and experimenting much more quickly about how we do better service delivery, particularly in the social space. And these were a half a dozen principles that we've come up with, particularly from the TAXI point of view, Carolyn Curtis, the CEO particularly, about ways in which I think service delivery increasingly in the future is going to have to work. So I'll run through them very quickly. I won't read out every word, but the first one is essentially recognizing that our solutions have to start grabbing hold of and engaging underlying structures and conditions. We're trying to solve big complex challenges here. We can't just be satisfied with solving immediate problems, although there's nothing wrong with clearly trying to solve a problem right now. Increasingly, we're trying to tackle root causes, not just relieving symptoms. That's not a new principle, clearly, but increasingly, I think we've reached the stage where many of our service delivery systems, we really have got now to turn our minds to tackling some of the root causes that raise the issues. One quick example, when I read the interim report of the Aged Care Royal Commission, in the first chapter, they remind us that in the last 40 years in Australia, we've had 35 major reviews into aged care. That's almost one review a year. That seems to me to be a suggestion that we've spent too much of our time, if I can put it like this, admiring the symptoms, admiring the problem, and not enough time trying to get to the root causes. Christian's already said this, so I'm going to reinforce it. Hypothesis-driven experiments, yep. We've got to learn how to do that more rapidly, more purposefully, and more carefully. The idea of careful risk-taking sounds a little bit oxymoron of where we've got to go. Different types of knowledge and evidence to constantly test what's working. I thought Christian's last observation in response to his the plea from Kate about, so how do we measure all this stuff? Well, look for signs for success. Don't get too hung up on profoundly scientific proofs all the time, and look widely for signs of success. Don't just look for randomized controlled trials, or there's nothing wrong with RCTs, but go and observe, go and look, go and ask people, go and see if indeed there is a shift in behavior and values. Last couple, support activities that work across sectors. I think that's becoming more and more true, that we need to find ways to blend resources and expertise across sectors. And finally, let's make sure that the people and the communities who are most directly affected are right at the center of this thing. Again, not something we've been shy of saying, human-centered, user-centered. Christian's given some more examples and so on. But again, those seem to me to be powerful signs of a service delivery culture that increasingly is going to be where we're going to go if we want to marry up empathy, competence, and trust. Kate, can you roll to the next slide? Thanks. So I'm beginning to start talking to a number of people about whether we can, now with danger with labels because they become great hashtags, but I don't know whether this is helpful, but for me, it's beginning to be helpful that we're almost beginning to see the emergence of a new kind of public work. And by that, I mean, it's solving problems not only to improve lives now, but gradually shifting the structures and systems and conditions that create the complex challenges in the first place that affect our lives in common. So it's not public sector work per se, although the public sector is at the heart of it. It's work that involves a lot of different people, a lot of different sectors, but this is about solving problems that affect all of us. That's the public part of it. These are problems and risks and opportunities, and we're right in the middle of one of them right this minute, where increasingly what matters is not just the role and work of what government does, but what individuals do, what citizens do, what companies do, and so on. I think we're beginning to see the emergence of something we might find useful to label as new public work or public work. If we just scroll up again, Kate, I'll take that a little bit further. And I'll draw here on an article that you can go and read in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, co-written by a woman called Anne-Marie Slaughter, who used to work in the Obama White House, among other things, and now runs one of America's think tanks. She's saying I think he's saying exactly the same thing. And she talks in the title, and the title page of the article is there on the right, and it's, the reference is there to one of last year's editions, the new practice of public problem solving. Look at the 4 elements she talks about: people-centered, experimental, data-enabled, designed to scale. That's exactly what we've been talking about for the last, hour and a half. I think it's what we've been talking about, particularly in New South Wales, for the last, 4 or 5 years. I think the Service New South Wales story is taking that direction. And I think the various iterations in this state of our digital strategy under Victor Dominello and others are taking us in that way. But look at the other thing. I think the quote in the middle there, which I'll just dwell on, and then I'm going to wrap up very shortly. The hallmarks of this new practice are humility, utility, and adaptability. I would argue, and I'll be happy for Christian later, maybe when we've got a few minutes before we wrap up, if he wanted to jump in, that kind of almost sums up the last decade, I think, of where we've been in the design-led approach to public innovation. Let's become, as public servants and as those we increasingly work with, across jurisdictional divides and sectional divides, let's adopt that kind of mantra: humility, utility, and adaptability. Practitioners start small, says Anne-Marie Slaughter, and recognize what they don't know. Cue the Danish Prime Minister. They believe in empiricism. They're not afraid to change their minds. What did Christian say just a moment ago? As things change, as you learn, change your indicators. As you learn, you will change your mind, and you should be changing your mind. They prize results over ideology. They align data with design for those they serve. Go and see those people first. And they understand that solutions, again, Christian said this, I think almost at the beginning of his talk, that solutions come in many forms. Law and policy, for sure, but technology, norms, culture, and collaboration. I think that article, I read it late last year, and I thought, yep, that's kind of where we're beginning to move. And we've spoken in our book, if I can just have one last comment about the book, that in many ways, I think in the public service, we've had over many, many years, an overly focused in attention to our own kind of power structures and what's going on inside the system. I think the public service, and a world-class public service, will become a problem-solving machine in the future. It always has been interested in solving problems, don't get me wrong. But I think the nature of the way we go about solving those problems in ways that are resonant, I think, with the examples and values that I've briefly sketched and that Christian, I think, opened up so powerfully early on. I think that's the new game we've got to get hold of as we become, as I say, a kind of a lean, mean problem-solving machine, as it were, if I can coin another phrase. If I think we've just got one more, if I can just get you to slide one more. And this is, in fact, in reference to a meeting that we are very much hopeful will happen later this year when we're all allowed to travel again. For the last few years, I've been working with the Queensland Public Service on something that they call their Business Improvement and Innovation in Government Group, or BIIG. And this year, we're having, you'll be surprised to hear, a meeting. Last year, we had about 850 people in the room. This year, we're hoping to have similar numbers, hopefully face-to-face, but possibly very digital as well, around exactly the ideas I've been quickly spruiking here: trust, empathy, and competence. And what we've actually decided to describe it as is essentially sort of an innovation reset, kind of press the reset button for 2020 and beyond, largely as a function of the current emergencies. And of course, in Australia, we've had fire, we've had flood, we've now had pestilence, we've had just about everything you can throw at us in the last 6 months. And I think what we're trying to do in that context is to itemize and identify the various elements that come together in what we might call now this new public work. I'm not going to go through those elements. You can read them for yourselves: digital, design, experiment, collaborating for big shared challenges, problem solving. I've said all these words before in the last 15 minutes. I think you're getting the point. It's when these ideas start to merge in new practice and a new set of beliefs about what it is to be a public servant. If I can go back to the C word, the craft word, the observation we're making in putting this conference together, and that we've been starting to play with others across the public service, is that it's the fusion of these ideas that is beginning to reset what it means to be an effective, a nuanced and a sophisticated public servant in the midst of this now more complex problem-solving world. So look, that's as far as I wanted to take it, Kate. I know people have been listening patiently for quite some time. I'm very happy again to take observations, comments, or reflections. Christian himself may want to jump in again. And I know we've got a few remarks, I hope, at some point before we finish, when Scott's able to get back from the SEC board. But thanks anyway for the chance to contribute. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Martin. That was great. And Scott is back with us. So we're all together again. So I'll just remind everybody to post their questions for Martin via the chat function or using the Twitter hashtag. I've just lost Twitter. NSW WCPS, New South Wales World Class Public Service. So Martin, I might kick off and
Sure.
pick up something from the book as well as something from your slides, where you talked about the three concepts, and one being the idea of not just transparent, but actually understandable.
Legible.
And so,
yep.
So the question is, we're talking about rapid advancements in automation and AI, and the ethical considerations that the public sector is going to face when we start to implement these technologies. How do we start making that go beyond transparency when we start to use these new ways of making decisions and delivering services? What do we do?
Great point. Well, I've got one particular observation. Other people on this call, excuse me, might have others. The first thing is, well, not the first thing. The most important thing is, how do we shift the locus of control and the mix of voices that make the decisions in the first place? Seems to me, and funny enough, we said this at the very first element of that very last slide, the sort of elements of the new public work. So under digital, we've said finding a better ethical balance between human and machine capabilities of emerging digital tools and so on and so forth. So it strikes me that part of our difficulty is that too many of the decisions about AI are being made by people whose primary interest and whose primary focus is the technology. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that if that's the only or the dominant, if you like, control vector, I think we've lost the game almost before we started. Because it seems to me what we have to do is infuse people, the human element of the dimension, into the business of where we go in the first place to develop these AI capabilities and indeed many of these AI functions. Again, Christian may have views about this. Other people on this call, I suspect, are having this conversation in their different parts of their work. But it strikes me that if the fundamental decision-making process about where we go with AI and how it develops is not at its very beginning deeply influenced, at least, if not actually controlled by the human dimension of this, then I think we've kind of almost lost the game before we started. So that's kind of where I'd be putting most of my, that's where I'd be putting my bets. Because I mean, the risk is, once the AI genie, as they say, is out of the bottle, to some extent I get that, you know, experiments happen and boom, suddenly we can do something with AI and it's kind of, wow, let's do it. It's so difficult to rein it back and say, wait, you know, we've got to think about how this is going to land in people's lives and in people's work. If we can have that conversation a little bit earlier, a little bit closer to the beginning, that seems to me to at least to be some kind of way in which we can begin. But again,
can I jump in on that one?
Views. Yes, please, Christian. That would be great.
Because when you say, can we do that in the beginning and a little bit earlier, and can we start with that, then you're talking about design, of course.
Of course.
We sometimes call design forethought for action, right? That's the thinking that goes in before you act. And so we've done some work and over the last year or so at the Danish Design Center on ethics in AI and design, and working also with the industry, so with the Danish design and digital design agencies on exploring what are the dilemmas and challenges. And basically what we found is that we need some way to navigate, because right now you have, you know, thousands of decisions being made in the design of digital products that go into government services, but also go into the private sector, where the people who build them are, as you also say very rightly, they are technology people, they are product people who build stuff because they can, and they can scale, and it can, by the way, it can scale very, very fast. But they do not necessarily build stuff and think about whether it might do harm or not. And so we already have a lot of examples of quite harmful AIs entering the world, both from the private sector, of course, with the Cambridge Analytica stuff and what else was going on there, but also unintended biases going into everything from job search engines to credit card maximums and so on. So it's happening. And the European Union came out with a big white paper actually on AI and ethics not so long ago, and the word design was in there 15 times, because simply we have to shift the decision-making process all the way back to where we build the things. And the people who build, technologists, digital people, designers, what kind of conversations are they having, and who are they having those conversations with? And how do they take an ethical, a much more broader ethical perspective on what they do? So I think it's a very pertinent and critical conversation we need to have.
Yeah, of course, we've had an example here. Many people on this call will know, at the national level, the so-called robo-debt problem with Centrelink of you know, assuming that people owed the government money because an AI system told the government they did. Turns out it's largely illegal, and most of that money will have to be returned. So, you know, it's not like we've got plenty of good examples here too, I think.
And it's not a new idea. I worked for 20 years ago on systems where we did not have AI back then, but we did have statistics, and using statistical profiling of citizens in job employment services, for example, it was already back then a big conversation.
The same dilemma.
It's still there, yeah.
Terrific.
It probably leads very nicely into to a question that we've just had from Francis. Francis asked whether you think the reputation of government, so for example, how competent we are, differs between levels of government, or whether you think we're in a shared pool of trust and reputation.
My very quick answer is the second part of that question is no, there is no shared pool. I think each government, each jurisdiction has to earn its own. Really interesting story about Andrew Cuomo. He is now generating followership, if I can put it like that, in terms of his daily morning briefings from people outside the US, because they just find him so trustworthy, so straightforward, and so simple. This guy who is the governor of New York State is now beginning to speak, almost to a sort of global citizenry around this stuff. So anyway, my sense is we don't have a shared pool, and in Australia, there's no question it's different to different levels. And if I might be a little bit controversial, and I'm going to anyway, it strikes me the current emergency is indicating that we have a slightly different level of capability and trustworthiness being manifest at both the national and the state level. There's no question about that. Now, when I say that as a provocation, look, it's in every major newspaper in the country at the moment. And I think the state governments, if I might say so, particularly on the eastern seaboard, have done an amazing job of learning, if I can put it in very simple terms, and I don't mean to sound trite about this, what it means to be empathetic, competent, and therefore trustworthy. The point about the trust word, and if anyone read the latest Edelman Trust Barometer, if you read those reports every year, I mean, the current one for government is awful. I mean, it's terrible reading. But the point about trust is you don't claim it, you earn it. And you earn it by being empathetic and competent. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. So no, they're highly differentiated. And I don't think one jurisdiction can, as it were, live off the trust of somebody else. No, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you. Got a question from Meredith, who works in population health, and says they have lots of challenges, for example, childhood obesity, smoking, and finding that community views are evolving quite rapidly. Their focus now is to redesign prevention support programs where vulnerable populations have the greatest need. Can you say a little bit more about how these elements work in this context?
Yeah, great point. I mean, and again, I suspect as he's listening to this question, Christian's ready to jump into my and others. My sense is that the first observation you would make is that the voices in the room when you start the redesigning have to be different than perhaps they once were. And by that, I mean, it's not about coming up with some ideas about redesigning your programs and then going and getting some feedback from people. It's actually about, and I think one of the charts I think that Christian brought up was this gradual transformation we've had, or transition over many years, to that, I think, right-hand side of one of those charts which talked about the co-production. Now, the co-production language and the co-design language, in my view, has become almost trite and therefore risky, because the minute you say it, it's almost like people stop listening. But actually, of course, like all cliches, it's actually very powerful. So the notion that the very people whose lives you're trying to impact and affect ought to be at the front of the process of redesigning what you're doing to help them seems to me to be a very obvious point, but it turns out to be relatively revolutionary. So I think some of the techniques, some of the instincts, and if I might say so, some of the leadership behaviors that are required in order to allow users and those most directly affected to be much more embedded in the process right from the start of creating the precepts, the preconditions for the redesign is the place to start, as opposed to assuming that you can draw on them later down the path. That would be certainly one reflex from my end.
Can I jump in quickly as well on this one? So in addition to exactly what Martin said, I mean, obviously you have to spend time with people, bring them in and co-design with them. And again, the reason that co-design has become sort of a thing is that it's everybody's saying it. It's just really still difficult to do, right? But I think the other one is bring the system in, or systems, because the kinds of really difficult root causes and challenges you're looking at in those kinds of problems require quite a diverse set of stakeholders, and probably more than you think. If you start really mapping them out and just visualizing the entire ecosystem of stakeholders across some of those problem sets, it's quite diverse. And bringing them in early so that they also see the problem and they also are along on the journey of discovery and of interventions and experimentation and co-design and so on is critical. I actually looked at a quite interesting study from some of the work done on designing out crime, also in Sydney, and over the last 10 years or so. And it turns out that there was a lot of successes, but also some failures. And one of the key points of this study, this piece of academic research, was that the broad system was not brought in early enough, which means that if you come up with your beautiful solutions and say, this is what we're going to do, and everyone around the system don't see it, and they were certainly not part of it, and they didn't invent it, and so they're not going to take ownership for it, and then they're not going to implement it, and then you're back to square one. So I think the one is the users, the other one is the system.
I think it's a great point. Sorry if I can add, therefore, and sort of, in a sense, correct myself slightly. I think the risk for policymakers and people inside large, complex institutions like public health systems is that the design language and the sort of stuff we've been talking about here for the last hour and a half makes it feel as though we're actually sidelining institutional expertise and suggesting it's not important anymore. You know, just stand back. You guys have screwed it up. Why don't we just ask the citizens? Why don't we just ask the users? They'll fix it. You know, a couple of workshops and some post-it notes, we should be fine. And now I'm being a bit trite, but a bit facetious, but you know my point. I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a sense of mutual respect here that needs to be understood. And one of the things I'm interested in as a result of the current emergency is whether we are in fact rediscovering our respect for properly situated and well explained expertise as a very, very important part. Expertise which is built and curated in large, complex, long-term systems. And that needs to be at the table too. Otherwise, the worry is you end up in this dialogue of the deaf, right? Institutions think they're being ignored, people think they're being ignored, and we just sort of spit at each other across the table. Not helpful. So yeah, you're right. The institutional expertise is a key part of the game, but it can't be the only part. So yes, that's a slight twist to what I said earlier. So thanks for the reminder. It was a good one. Thank you.
Okay. I'll ask you this, Martin, and it's a question that I've asked you before, but I'm going to ask it in a new context as well. Your book asks, "Are we there yet?" How are we going to know when we're there? In the current context, you've asked the question yourself. How do we make sure that we move forward and not go back to the situation we're in? So my question is, how do we burn the bridge behind us? How do we make sure that we move forward from this point?
Such a good question. They do say that, about bridge burning. There's a great story about, one of the great Spanish explorers in whenever it was, 15th, 16th century, when they landed on the coast of Central America, basically after they all got onto the shore, turned around to his men and said, I want you to burn the boats and in the rowboats. And they said, what the hell are you doing that for? How are we going to get back to the ship? And he said, we're not going back to the ship. That's the point. We're going through here. Anyway, you get the point. There are two ways we'll know whether we change. One is a set, and mostly it's observational. One is a set of beliefs, and the other will be a set of behaviors. And it seems to me that the world that we've briefly sketched out here, that Simon and I wrote about in our book, and Christian has written about in rather more books than I've written, and all the rest of it, I think we're beginning to get a pretty strong sense of the kinds of beliefs that we would expect world-class public servants in the future to hold, and therefore the kinds of behavior that we would expect to see from those world-class public servants, how they spend money, how they experiment, how they engage with citizens. So my own view is that we will begin to feel that we're getting there. First of all, when the digital piece is simply infused completely into that journey, and when we start to see very strong evidence that that cycle of trust, empathy, and competence is actually beginning to be manifest in pretty much every dimension of the way we see public servants working. So to me, I'm going to take a leaf out of the Christian book here. I'd be looking for signs of success rather than necessarily at some point, on a Tuesday morning in 4 years' time, we'll be able to declare, yep, we are now there. The other point we make in the book, by the way, is that every time we're getting there keeps changing. Okay, so we get that. But yeah, beliefs and behaviours, and go and look, go and watch, because I think it'll be pretty bloody obvious quite soon whether, as a generality across the institution of the New South Wales Public Service, we see behaviours and beliefs of the sort we've been talking about for the last hour and 40 minutes, or we don't. That would be my call.
Thanks, Martin. Christian, did you want to add anything more to that one?
Yeah, so, you know, Denmark is consistently ranked as one of the happiest countries in the world. Not so sure whether that's the most important indicator for a country, but I do think that the other one is interesting, is that Denmark is ranked very highly on trust. Connected with that, by the way, also with very high competitiveness, all those things that just like Australia is, performing quite well economically. And just building on Martin's point, I think there's this question of what you might call institutional competitiveness, which is that it matters to a society whether you have high quality, world-class, high-performing public sector institutions that generate a very high level of trust, because trust makes a society run cheaper. Trust is highly efficient. Trust is something that makes it easier to run a business. It makes it less bureaucratic to get permits. It makes it less bureaucratic to open a bank account. Trust makes people. It's basically kind of the oil in the machine, so to speak. And so countries with a very high level of trust institutions are also generally countries that are highly competitive and therefore generate wealth and prosperity. So I think you can measure the outcome of trust on those metrics very much so. And you can also, of course, see the opposite, that the countries where you have trust eroding, you lose competitiveness of institutions and you lose prosperity. And so I think it's a highly critical root cause of performance of a country.
Okay, thank you very much. There are a few more questions popping through the chat function, but I think in the interest of time, we might move on, and I'll introduce our final speaker. Scott Johnston. Scott is the Acting Commissioner of the New South Wales Public Service Commission. Scott joined the PSC in 2014 after a long career working in statistics in both in the UK and in Australia. So talk about statistics being the forerunners of AI there, Christian. We've got a man who embodies both. So Scott's been acting as the New South Wales Public Service Commissioner since October last year, and he has been leading a lot of digital transformation work right across the sector in terms of digital capabilities, but also digital leadership. So I'll hand over to Scott. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. What a fantastic morning. I think every day's felt pretty heavy the last few weeks, but to start bright and early, or late and still bright for Christian, to start the week like this is just a fantastic thing. So I've got a few words. I just want to reflect a little bit on what we've talked about today, but also some of the positioning around New South Wales government and the public service around lifting digital leadership and capability. I've been thinking for quite a while about and talking around work of the future, and trying to reframe that in my mind to being much more about what is a modern public servant, what's a modern civil servant, and what we've talked about today is the skills and the capabilities that all of us need to be embracing. It's complex because it's different, but the case studies and the examples of success are profound, and I think this is the model, and if we're building our DNA around actually service delivery and excellence, thinking about digital capability makes us a very different place. The world-class public service notion, we've got a Premier's priority of being a world-class public service, and the last few weeks I've had a number of discussions about what does that mean in a time where we're buckling down and dealing with some of the hardest issues we've ever dealt with. To me, it's more relevant than ever. This is where our excellence and our credibility and our performance will be most judged. And we're seeing in the last few weeks, things that would have taken 6 months have been done in 2 days or 3 days. still trying to keep the citizen and the customer at the center of our thinking, but how innovatively can we think about barriers that we just accepted in the past being removed so that we could do things better. It's a truly remarkable time, and I genuinely think it'll change everything for us for forever. And this will start framing actually what is excellence and world class that's relevant for New South Wales, because we're caring more and more, about all the decisions we're making and the impact on our people. Just how do we do it in an effective, efficient way? We make mistakes, but we learn, but we do it in the right way at pace. So the other point that Christian and Martin talked a lot about was around values, and that delights me as the acting Public Service Commissioner, because values are at the heart of what the Public Service Commission is advocating across New South Wales government. But they're also so critical when we think about how we change in the way we work and how we actually make sense of the words integrity, accountability, trust, and customer service. They're perfectly embodied in what we're talking about when we think about how do we design new solutions, how do we work in a way that actually makes a fundamental difference to the citizens of our state and the country. And so values and reframing values in a modern context is really important, and probably something we all need to do daily almost, to think about how we're acting and how do we make decisions, because pace is a real challenge. But digital ways of working and technology have become central to the way we interact with people and deliver services. So it's more prevalent in the current climate, but it's something we've been doing for a while. We've seen the past few months governments being able to respond to challenges faced in New South Wales and pivoted the ways of working to take advantage of opportunities that digitisation enables. If we look at the bushfire crisis that we saw, the way that we were able to, there was the Rural Fire Service app that told us where fires were in location and relative to all of us, was downloaded by a phenomenal amount of people and practically saved lives, using data and using insight to think about what problems do we currently have are really critical and make a real difference. In the current times of the coronavirus, use technology, digital ways of working have enabled us to continue to work from remote locations, continue to serve our customers and our community in a safe and transparent way. I mean, just to think that we're doing this session in various locations when previously, a month or two ago, we thought we all had to be in one room. Now, it's nice to be in one room and it's fantastic, and I genuinely can't wait for that to happen again, but we're doing things differently, quickly, and we're responding in an agile way. And so we're all looking at how can we keep doing what we're trying to do in the best possible method. Here at the Commission, we've embarked over the past year on a New South Wales government sector-wide project to build a digital capability framework. Martin's been part of that work, helping us, and thinking about the learning pathways that we all need to operate in a digital world. Our profound challenge is about trying to get scale. How do we get everyone thinking differently rather than just talking about the digital accelerators of excellence in some parts, but how can we get to a tipping point where we're all thinking and acting in a different way? We all become learners, and then we become teachers, and we become masters of a craft that's quite different in the way we approach problems. I can feel a sense that it's changing, but there's 408,000 people in New South Wales government, so it's hard and it'll take time. In the longer term, to make this a reality, we need strong digital leadership, which is part of what today's about. Leadership that moves beyond digital to digital. It embraces digital uplift and a mindset shift to transform the work and culture of our government in order to become a world-class public service. Now, this doesn't mean everything's online. This is about how do we make sure when we need analog, we can do it in the right way, and technology and digital thinking can actually embrace this. We've had a lot of debate around New South Wales government about what is digital leadership a thing, or is it just, or a capability in itself, or do we just carry on and think that this will be just part of our change? But actually, we really need to focus on digital leadership. So these are the skills needed to enable successful change. It's not always leading from the front, it's leading from behind and corralling and convincing and encouraging and supporting people that in this current world, everyone is a leader. because we're empowering people to make decisions, do small scale projects, scale on, and think about how it gets bigger. So we need to shift our leadership style to be energizing and empowering to provide increased engagement and autonomy to our people. Better adopt more open and collaborative styles of working that'll turn better results and meet our customers' expectations, to embrace digital, to embrace a digital and agile way of working. So lastly, and to me most importantly about what talking around digital, is that we need to adopt this growth mindset. It means that we have to be open to continuous personal and professional development and embed that within our organisational culture. As leaders, our role is not just our own, but it's how do we share and create the environment where people can learn and grow, that we can be wrong and we can adjust and we can build on. These are challenging, and this is actually working right in the ambiguity that most of us feel uncomfortable with. I'd like to thank Christian and Martin. Both of those sessions. Now, I have to admit, Martin mentioned it, I had to duck out for 25 minutes to join the Secretary's Board, but I'd had a preview of his slides, and I've spoken to Martin many times about this stuff. It's really fantastic to think about when we're thinking about how we change, that we get the very best to guide us, and Christian and Martin are very much positioned us in that way. But so if I could finish with some reflections about today's working and like today as in the 30th of March, and some of the real risks that I think we face, and the insights that we've talked around this morning actually can give us some of the solutions to. So we've got greater risk of social disconnection and the drive towards inclusion that in New South Wales government we've been pushing for quite a while is now at real risk. We run risk of seeing policy development on the fly. The pace of change and the pace of policy development is unprecedented in our time. But how can we work at pace but still be considered on the right things? The risk of making a misstep with the complexities of society, rather than having simple solutions, thinking that they fit all, is a high risk. And we have a lack of control over communication and messaging that is really exaggerated from whatever we've seen in the past. So things change and people perceive an intent in the way that it wasn't ever intended, but it means that we actually have a lot less control over what we're doing. And also practically means it's challenging getting people with the right skills together at the right time. So my thinking over the past few weeks particularly, and reinforced this morning, was about we need to be determined, and we need to be determined in a few ways. The first is around innovation. We're solving problems in 3 days that we took 6 months or a year to do previously. We're thinking creatively, how can we still talk to Christian on a Monday morning in Copenhagen and still get hopefully as many people engaged with this discussion as we would have if we did it in a room. We have to be resilient, and we're personally challenged in this as well as in leadership. And the ambiguity of what tomorrow brings and current problems today has never been greater. But the courage and the persistence to just ride with it and work through it and use the support mechanisms and support networks that we have to do that, I think is a profound opportunity, but also a must. And to the 2 points that really struck me with all this was that we can't compromise on two things, and one is empathy. This is critical in understanding the things that we're doing and why we're doing them, but actually how we get the greatest impact in any action that we have. And then secondly, always putting the customer and the citizen at the center of what we do. Designing solutions that might be a tech solution with no problem that it's understanding that it clearly is solving is not the right thing to do, and will cause a lack of trust and a lack of commitment from everyone involved as well, and ultimately causes issues. So leadership, as my parting comment, would be that I think leadership has never been more challenged than today, and all of us, and leadership reflects on every single one of us on this call. We all need to stand up, but think about actually how can I lead, not like I did last year or even last month, but today. And we'll all work through this and actually be much, much better people, but also much better leaders. And I think fundamentally, this shift towards a digital New South Wales government and a world-class public service will really take shape. So thanks everyone. I'll quickly throw back to Kate to wrap it up, but I hope everyone has a good week and stays well. Cheers.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. Thank you to all our speakers this morning. It's been a wonderful session. If you have a look at the ongoing chat, everyone's saying what a great time they've had, and thanking us for continuing to run the session, even though, as Scott says, it was intended to be a face-to-face session. And Scott, I'm not sure if you'd joined the call first thing when Christian was saying he thought he'd be surfing in Sydney this morning, and he's in snowy Copenhagen. So really big thanks to everyone who's
next time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there will be next time. That's the point.
Yeah. Next time we'll come and we'll play in the snow, I think. I think that'd be great.
You're most
we've
welcome.
had lots of comments from people in regional New South Wales saying how much they've enjoyed being able to collaborate and participate in an event like this. And so I think it is a lesson about burning that bridge behind us and making sure that we are more inclusive as we move forward in our brave new world. So we've had some requests to record this session, which we've done. We'll also work out how it is we capture the chat function and everything that was tweeted on that hashtag, and we'll make the session available on the Public Service Commission website, and we'll make sure that we email all the participants and let them know when that's live. So huge thank you to Martin, Christian and Scott for their presentations today, and thanks to everyone who joined us online. I think we topped out about 75 participants, so that's not
cool.
too bad for a first time.
And well done you indeed. That was fantastic. That's really very impressive. And please do send the slides to everyone straight away. Everyone can send those as soon as you can.
Just share mine as well.
Great.
Thanks so much, Christian. Really appreciate it.
Mate. Have a great day, everyone.
We'll talk to you soon. Enjoy your evening. What's left of it.
That's right.
See you, mate.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. All the best.